Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters, and peace to non-Muslims that are here. Thank you all for coming. I really like giving positive education about Islam. That's why I exist here on the internet in this particular, I guess I could say, Islamic capacity. So if you haven't, please check out our Quora space. It's an excellent source for all things Islam and indeed even anti-Islam. We have a lot of freedom of speech there for Islam's critics, and I genuinely enjoy learning even more about Islam through them. And that's the funniest thing about it, is anti-Islamics have caused me to do so much research that I know a lot more about Islam than I think I would naturally, you know. If anti-Islamics didn't exist, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have this Quora space that is becoming so successful thanks to all of the followers. And yeah, I really enjoy doing this. And my main mission isn't to convert anyone. All I'm trying to do is talk about Orthodox Islam and essentially critique what anti-Islamics have to say. And in this case, in the case of Aisha, mother of the believers, may Allah be pleased with her, there are some issues with history, essentially. In the interest of showing you that I'm honest and being honest, because I've been on the internet for far too long, I'm going to show this video in its entirety. I'm totally unsure why this person blurs out their face, but you know, whatever. I feel like it's just for dramatic purposes, right? It is YouTube and it is meant for entertainment. So even if you're trying to be academic, which I think this person is, you know, if you add this little bit of cinema to what you're doing, it makes more people watch it, right? I also don't understand why he has his phone in front of him, unless maybe he's reading it, which is totally fine. I mean, you could also put a computer monitor, you know, beyond the camera, but, you know, whatever. I use a tablet if I ever have to do that. I just put my iPad on a stand, you know, and go. But anyway, I think that this is a video that is slightly more honest than most. Whether he actually talked to a scholar or not, I don't know. But you'll see that this alleged scholar's argument is not just standard, but also pretty bad, and there are better arguments out there. Incidentally, I want to thank you all because I've been putting my Islamic songs on these videos. I want to thank you all for checking those out. I see that I'm getting more listens, so thank you all, and I hope that it encourages you to become even closer to Allah than you are now. So without further ado, here is the video that I found on YouTube.
So off the back of my previous video where I was talking about Aisha, I wanted to go and speak to some sheikhs about this in my home city, right? Some scholars who actually know what they're talking about, because every time I ask a Muslim about difficult questions, a lot of them will just say to me, look, I'm not a scholar, go and ask a scholar. So I thought I would go and ask a scholar. I'll do what they're telling me to do.
Right off the bat, I'm a fan of this video. It's open, it's not polemicist like some people I know, David Wood. And it seems reasonable pretty much throughout. But there are some things that you just don't catch as the audience. He's talking about, oh, go find a scholar. You can find scholarly works on this thing that we've had for quite some time now called the internet. So, yeah.
Now, I contacted quite a few, and I've only so far had a discussion with one, but I've got two others lined up. Now, I went to this scholar, and I basically gave them a few points of discussion I wanted to talk to them about. This was not a debate. I do not like debates. I think in most cases, the debates we watch online and, you know, things like that, they're very much an ego match. No one really wants to learn or listen or exchange ideas. I'm not a fan of that. So I want a sit down, calm, you know, logical, intellectual discussion. And that's what I had, thankfully. So I contacted the sheikh and I was saying to him, So these are my points. Over a voice note, I said, I want to talk about a moral issue I have with Islam. I want to talk about some scientific errors, some mathematical errors.
The claims of science and such in the Holy Quran is something completely unique to the 20th and 21st centuries, because that was when we became more advanced in science, of course. So, yeah, I am not a proponent of these ideas. I don't think science and math are really in the Holy Quran. I don't think it needs to be. It's a spiritual book, not a textbook.
And he started by sending me a podcast saying, okay, starting about this moral dilemma you have about Aisha and Muhammad, listen to this podcast I made, or this talk that I did. And I said, look, I really want to talk in person. I don't think we can have this discussion over a voice note on WhatsApp or by texting. And he said, okay, just watch this and just let me know what you think. And I watched it and I said, listen, you're giving me answers to the standard questions. I've heard these all before. My questions go a lot deeper. I'm a fairly educated person. I was Muslim for 7-8 years. I do know what I'm talking about. I don't think these answers you're giving me over a text are sufficient. And he sent me an explanation about Muhammad and Aisha, and I responded by saying, I think this is a poor explanation. It is essentially justifying a word beginning with P. And he said, oh, no, I think you misunderstand me. Let's have a phone call tomorrow at 10 a.m. So I hopped on the phone the next day at 10 a.m. and we started our discussion. And so I gave him the same question that I gave you on my previous videos. Do you think Muhammad is the best example for all of humanity in the past, present and future? He said yes. And I said, so do you condemn Muhammad for marrying Aisha when she was 6 and consummating the marriage when she was 9? And he said, no, of course not. You have to look at the historical context. And of course, I replied in the same way by saying, I don't care about the historical context. You're telling me that he is the best example now.
So this is something that Muslims and non get very confused about. The thing that goes throughout time is the ethics, right? So Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, mother of the believers, she was wed basically with her family's consent. It wasn't just Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam just fell out of the sky and married her. It was a little more complex. Recently, the same point was brought up about slavery and that, quote unquote, real Muslims should own slaves because the Quran says so. I mean, the Holy Quran also says to free slaves, by the way. And yeah, by 20th century standards, slavery is a terrible thing. But we're talking about 600 AD. We're talking about the 7th century. And yeah, historical context is important. But also what's important is ethical context. And that is what Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought to marriage, slavery, etc. That is the timeless example, is to bring the ethics of Islam into your own life, into your own time. Pretty simple.
And he married a child. And so we began exchanging ideas and talking about this. And the biggest point he really had was that children developed faster in the past. And I said, what do you mean by this? He said physically and mentally they developed faster. And I said, where is your evidence? Because there is no evidence whatsoever for either statement, physically or mentally. Physically, children, the best evidence we have shows that children are developing faster now because we have access to far better nutrition. And on top of that, we have far better living conditions. So they're actually getting their periods earlier and children are developing earlier. People are getting taller, bigger. This was not the case in the past and there is no evidence to suggest they ever were. And in terms of mental development, I also made the point to him that brain development We've got the same brain now as we did in the 7th century in Arabia. The prefrontal cortex, which is so vital for your decision making, your long-term accountability and judgments, all these things you use to kind of, navigate your life. It kind of originates from this part of the brain, and it's not fully developed in a female until 25 years old. And so I said physically, the development in the brain was no different. Sure, kids back then would have had jobs. They would have been more responsible. So they would have been a bit more mature mentally. But that is no different than any child growing up today in a war zone or an incredibly impoverished area. The difference is not the time, the century. The difference in a child's maturity is social and cultural impacts, essentially. If you grow up incredibly poor around tough environments in a war zone, you're going to be naturally a bit more mentally mature. But that does not justify someone today going and marrying a 6-year-old Palestinian girl because she is more mature. So he said, you know what, I don't actually know about the biology or the science, so I'm actually going to go away and research this. And I appreciated that very much because he was open and honest. He said, look, I don't know kind of what you're talking about. I've learnt that children in the past developed earlier. I don't know where I've heard this from or why I believe it. I'm going to now research this. But he did say that regardless of what the evidence says, even if they didn't develop earlier in the past, it still wouldn't be an issue for him because the Quran is miraculous.
All right, well, this is an excellent opportunity to spill the beans. So let's go. So first of all, this is not in the Holy Quran. So whatever scholar he may have spoken to may have said that, but I feel like that's a deliberate misquote. It may not be. It could be an honest mistake. I don't know. But these are in ahadith. There are a handful of ahadith, maybe 5. And ahadith are simply narrations, right? And scholars both agree and disagree on this ahadith and that ahadith. They're rated certain ways, or graded, I should say. And the best grade is Sahih. And then when people look at the collection called Sahih, they think everything in it is Sahih, but it's not. It varies on what scholar you ask. So that being said, that's just like a crash course, very big crash course in ahadith. I suggest if you are not a Muslim, or if you are a Muslim and don't quite understand how ahadith work, you should simply look them up. These ahadith are alleged to have been said by Aisha, mother of the believers. May Allah be pleased with her. They're alleged to be said by her herself. But the problem is, I believe these ahadith come up at least 100 years after her lifetime. So the biggest problem, and what leads me to skepticism about these particular ahadith on this particular subject, is that they are the only source for this. We don't have any, Zoroastrian record of the marriage, or I don't know, there's no other evidence out there other than these 5 ahadith. So that should alone make you skeptical. My second point is, why do anti-Islamics believe in ahadith? Why do they believe ahadith? Not even, this topic is a contention among Muslims themselves. So I don't understand why anti-Islamics who don't believe in Islam believe ahadith, other than for their arguments, which is sad. And I've had people tell me on the internet that, all Islamic sources are garbage or whatever, and then they go on to talk about this, maybe perhaps not realizing that they're quoting ahadith. And then I ask them, hey, why do you believe in ahadith? And I've never gotten an answer. So there are 2 possibilities here. The first one I just said is that this is ahistorical. The best thing I think we can say about this is that we just don't know if this is true or not. Okay. Now, the next thing is, if we just go ahead and assume that these are true, we could say that maybe Aisha, mother of the believers, may Allah be pleased with her, maybe she had this thing called precocious puberty. And that is when puberty comes on earlier than normal. Now, at the time, they wouldn't have known about this. They didn't have information. I believe this was discovered in the 20th century. Can't really remember when. And I've mentioned this on Quora, and there are people who said, yeah, scholars pointed that out too. She could have been of essentially legal age then, would have been puberty, right? It is in Judaism, essentially. And it would have been just kind of the norm. Lower lifespans, you would obviously get married earlier. So, yeah, there's that aspect to it too. And again, I really insist that we just say, we don't know. We can't verify this. This is not historical, and that is the largest problem, especially if you are an anti-Islamic who claims to not believe in Islamic sources, except for when it suits your arguments. That's another big issue here.
Now, we never actually got to our discussions on the scientific errors and mathematical errors in the Quran. I'm hoping we get a second phone call. He said he'd call me back the next day, but I've not heard a single thing. Maybe he has been busy. Maybe he has read the research and found out that no, children didn't develop earlier in the past, Hopefully he's just been busy and we can continue, this discussion. But irrespective of any of this is the fact that in Hadith, Aisha says she is 6 years old when they got married and 9 years old when the marriage was consummated, right? That shows obviously her age. Even if you wanted to claim she was mature at the time, she most definitely was not. Because we have Hadith where she is essentially playing with dolls, right? And of course, mature adults do not play with dolls. He actually made a response to this. He said to me, well, even adults today play on Xboxes. In the past, dolls were just like Xboxes today. So I said to him, no, that's an equivocation fallacy. They are not the same things. In Arabia, dolls were outlawed because they looked like idols. Only prepubescent children could play with dolls. And this was supported, I said to him, by Imam al-Nawawi and Ibn Hajar. I said, you can look at the commentaries on this hadith, the hadith, 2440, Aisha playing with dolls. And they literally say that this was limited to young girls who had not yet reached puberty. And he said, even being a sheikh, he said, you know what? I'm going to have to go and read these commentaries because I'm not too sure about that.
So again, I have the same two options here. We can simply interpret it a different way, but again, the most important thing is that we cannot historically verify any of this. Ahadith, you can take or leave in Islam, like particular ahadith. That is why they are graded by scholars. And even when one is graded as the best grade, that doesn't mean that that particular ahadith, or that particular hadith is actually correct. It just means that the chain of narration is sound. So, yeah, information can be lost, obviously, and possibly even made up, say, hundreds of years later. So that, I believe, is the nail in the coffin here, to be honest. And to boot, there is no Islamic law around this, and even the classical scholar he mentions, he put her at something like 14, I think, Ibn Kathir. I can't remember. But basically, scholars have put her marriage along with the timeline of historical Islamic events, and they found that she was actually older. Now, this was in the 14th century, mind you, which was, of course, free of 20th and 21st century morality. So, again, there's no law based on this, so the only argument anybody has is the whole example argument. But again, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is an example in marriage because of the ethics that he brought to it. And again, as long as we're using a hadith, Aisha, mother of the believers, may Allah be pleased with her, said that he even did the women's work from time to time, that he was the best husband. Okay, so that's when we talk about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being an example, that's what we mean. It's the ethics of Islam that you apply to, say it with me, your own time.
And irrespective of that, it corroborates with the Quran. If you look at Surah 65 verses 4, it essentially talks about the waiting period between marrying a woman after they've been divorced. And it specifically says about the waiting period being 3 months for a woman or girl who has not yet had their period, who have not yet menstruated. Now, if you look at the classical tafsirs, you've got Ibn Kathir saying this refers to young girls who have not yet reached the age of menstruation. You've got Tafsir Jalalayan, I can never pronounce his name properly, who says the same thing. It's about girls who are of a young age, they haven't yet had their periods, they've not menstruated yet. And you also got Al-Tabari saying the exact same thing. So it's not like you've got any source in the Quran or Hadith or scholarly commentaries which actually say, no, you're not allowed to marry a girl who is young and has not yet had her period, who has not menstruated yet.
Granted, this is absolutely true, but if it's given to an ignorant audience, they won't realize this particular important thing. Marriage and consummation of a marriage are two different things in Islam. So you have marriage, which is just a bond, right? And yeah, because in Islamic law, you can't have sex with your wife until she reaches puberty, yeah? That's why, basically, is marriage is different. It's, Westerners especially just equate the two immediately, yeah? And that's the thing, is that's not the way that works. You can wed someone, but also, they can be 4 years old even. But the thing is they are going to stay with their own family for a while, and then they move in with their husband. So it's kind of like an arrangement that happens. Incidentally, this is the same thing that's said about Aisha, mother of the believers, may Allah be pleased with her.
They literally say the opposite. So, yeah, it'll be very interesting to hear his response. But, yeah, it doesn't look promising in the slightest anyway. I do hope he gets back to me, but I just wanted to share this as a bit of an update on the research and discussions that I'm having around this topic. With educated people, because many people tell me in the comments to go and speak to an actual sheikh. I am, and yeah, they are ignoring me, and not wanting to talk to me, so yeah, very positive thing. Yeah, thought I'd just share that anyway. Thank you very much for watching, and God bless.
So the key takeaways here are ahadith are fallible. You can believe in one and not believe in the other, and that is totally typical, not just of lay Muslims, but of scholars. If he had talked to a scholar who was worth their salt, I would think more than just this would come up, but I don't know. I mean, maybe I have to argue about this stuff more than a scholar does because he speaks to Muslims, I suppose, and I normally have to defend these things, so maybe that's why I'm better at it, because I'm willing to bet whoever he spoke to knows a lot more about the Holy Quran than I do, and indeed even a hadith. I am not a scholar, but I am pretty confident that I can take this down as I did, because one, you can question just the historicity of it all. Did all this actually happen? What's the deal with that, and how do we prove it? So at best, we could say we just don't know if this is historical or not. Two, if it is historical, she could have suffered from something called precocious puberty, and those ahadith on playing with dolls could simply just be an admission of a sin. Who knows? That's what I mean. I can interpret this thing different, so that way it just doesn't work with your argument. It turns into semantics, right? Which can be a problem for both sides, which is why to me anyway, the underlying issue is the ahistoricalness of these particular ahadith. especially since they came at least 100 years, I believe 200 years after Aisha, mother of the believers, may God be pleased with her. So that in and of itself should cause skepticism. Another thing to take away here is the ethics of Islam, and that is the key takeaway for Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam being an example for all people at all times. You simply apply Islamic ethics to your time. That is why Muslims, for example, treated slaves better. There's just an ethical thing that happens, and you apply it to everything. So, last but certainly not least, we can also say that these critics are guilty of presentism because they're not looking at the historical context that this supposedly happened in. I know this particular person poo-pooed that, but I mean, that's like expecting the Dutch who brought the first slaves to the United States, that's like expecting them to know that slavery is wrong. How do they know that? It was a norm of their time. It's just a silly argument to say that we need to, use this particular behavior as a model for all time, because that's just not the way that it works. This is why scholarship is able to move with the times. This is why modern scholarship does not believe in slavery. Some modern scholars even want to put a year of marriage on women, for example. It goes on and on. But the biggest thing here to take away is do your own research. Look this stuff up, because when you just see this and you parrot it, as I think this person is parroting these arguments, you want to have a better handle on what you're saying and what you're doing, and come with counter arguments to the counter arguments. And I've never seen that in the case of this particular topic. And trust me, I've written on it extensively. I've commented with anti-Islamics on it, and they never tell me why they believe in ahadith, and they clearly display no knowledge of ahadith, and that would help them. Yeah, so critics, learn about Islam. I've been saying it for years. It's just going to make your argument better, and you'll know where you shouldn't waste your time. This is something you do not need to waste your time on, because it is basically pointless. We don't use it for Islamic law. So for someone like me who studies Islamic law, this is just a fairy tale that some people like to tell. That's the way that I see it. And again, at the most we can say we just don't know. This happens with other anti-Islamic arguments too, like of the Banu Qurayza. Supposedly they were all killed by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's forces, and there's no record of it other than in an hadith that came out something like 300 years after this event happened. And most importantly, there is no Jewish record of the event, and it's basically, I believe it to be a fairy tale too, because that's a very important thing. If we're going to look at history, it's good to have some corroborating evidence, and we just don't have that. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being open-minded, and I will see you in the next planned, non-impromptu version of Answering Anti-Islam. It is going to be a similar video where I critique the author of a book called The Palestinian Delusion.
Believe us, we can't undo it. Only he can forgive you.